Hello, my name is Jason Mercer, the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board's Chief Market Analyst. I would like to take the next few minutes to go through TREB's June Market Watch release and housing market outlook update. June represented a substantial turnaround relative to market activity experienced in April and May, and hopefully is a leading indicator for overall economic recovery from the COVID-19 related recession. So let's jump right in. Greater Toronto Area Realtors reported 8,701 sales through TREB's MLS system in June 2020. This result represented a very substantial increase over the May 2020 sales result, with sales up by 89% month over month. On a year-over-year basis, sales were only down by 1.4% compared to June 2019. In fact, year-over-year growth in sales was reported in some areas and market segments. Especially notable were the detached and townhome market segments in the GTA regions surrounding the city of Toronto. On the supply side of the market, new listings were up slightly on a year-over-year basis by 2.1%. However, active listings on TREB's MLS system at the end of June 2020 were down by 28.8% compared to June 2019. Growth in new listings will need to outstrip growth in sales for a number of months before active listings approach last year's levels. With the number of active listings remaining constrained, strong year-over-year price growth continued through June. The MLS Home Price Index composite benchmark was up by 8.2% year-over-year in June. The average selling price for all home types combined was $930,869, up by 11.9% compared to June 2019. The actual and seasonally adjusted average selling prices were also up substantially on the month-over-month compared to May 2020 by 7.8% and 9.8% respectively. Average and benchmark selling prices were up year-over-year for all major home types. The strongest average annual rates of price growth were experienced in the detached and semi-detached market segments in the City of Toronto at 14.3% and 22% respectively. This, coupled with the fact that average selling price growth outstripped growth in the MLS HPI benchmarks, points to a resurgence in the higher end market segments. So following the broader movement to reopen the economy in June, we experienced a very positive result in terms of home sales and selling prices. Before the onset of COVID-19, there was a great deal of pent-up demand in the market. This pent-up demand arguably increased further over the past 3 months. We are still in the early days of recovery, but barring any setbacks, we should continue to see stronger market conditions in the second half of 2020 as households look to satisfy their ownership housing needs. With this in mind, let's now turn to an updated market outlook for 2020. First off, in order to further gauge the impact of COVID-19 on the GTA housing market and to gain insight on what the future holds for housing demand and supply, TREB undertook a second wave of consumer polling through Ipsos between May 25th and May 31st, 2020. In line with the Ipsos polling results for April, 27% of respondents said they are likely to purchase a home over the next 12 months. This result was below the spring 2019 result of 31%, but given the credibility interval of plus or minus 3.9 percentage points for the survey, the result remained in line with past polling results. Listing intentions, while up from the April Ipsos poll at 21% versus 17% in April, the results still remained well below the 32% listings intentions mark recorded in the spring of 2019. The gap between buying intentions and listing intentions follows the broader trend exhibited in the GTA over the past few years and underpins the requirement for policymakers to take action on the housing supply front, both in terms of the aggregate supply and increasing the diversity of housing types available to home buyers. So looking forward, TREB now feels that given the strong handoff from June 2020, if sales follow the regular seasonal pattern in the second half of this year, 80,000 transactions will be a realistic target. If sales reach the 80,000 mark, this would represent an 8.8% decline compared to 2019. For reference, sales through the first 6 months of 2020 amounted to 35,972, down 18.5% compared to the same period in 2019, which suggests that we'll see a marked improvement in the second half of 2020. TREB's average price forecast released in February 2020 was $900,000. Given the current relationship between sales and listings in the GTA, coupled with the strong handoff from June 2020, this forecast remains realistic. In fact, if market conditions continue to unfold as they did in June, it is possible that the average price for 2020 could edge above the $900,000 mark. Through the first 6 months of 2020, the average selling price sat at over $891,000, including a June 2020 average price of almost $931,000. Generally speaking, an improving labor market conditions and historically low mortgage rates are expected to support a recovery in home sales in the second half of 2020, along with sustained year-over-year price growth. Given that home sales result in substantial spin-off expenditures in the regional economy, the housing market will be an important driver of overall economic recovery this year and into 2021. It is very important to note, however, that this outlook is predicated on the continued reopening of the economy, a gradually improving labor market situation in the GTA, and sustained low borrowing costs. However, there do remain substantial downside risks to the housing market, including a resurgence in COVID-19 cases, which could prompt a pause or even dialing back of the reopening in the GTA and related economic impacts, or the negative economic impact that could be associated with the resurgence of COVID-19 cases in the United States or other trading partners, which could impact trade, employment, and overall household wealth via equity markets. With all this in mind, it will be very interesting to see how things unfold in July, the first full month of summer. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.